Welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If your job involves working with or influencing people's behavior, this podcast offers invaluable insights into what makes people tick. Through personal interviews that are thoughtful and surprising, we explore the full range of the roots to people smarts that can help you make or break your own career. My name is Marie Gervais, and with a PhD in culture and learning in the workplace and my own cultural journey, I bring the mysteries of human beings at work around the world to you. Through conversations with very diverse people, examining the groups they were born into and the ones they chose to belong to, my podcast takes a deep dive into why people do what they do and how they belong. Hone your skills to manage others and to be a better human being at work with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. Today, I would love to present to you Daniel Gagnon, who is the co-founder of the Agile Leader Academy. And he is a leadership development coach, educator, and advisor, but has not come to that easily. He was born and raised in Montreal, is currently celebrating 40 years in the workforce on his sixth career, and he describes this as being a place of many self-disruptions and the story of anti-fragility, from which he learned some very nuanced understandings about psychological workplace safety. So from putting stages together as a stagehand in his early 20s to a leadership coach 6 careers later, I would love to present to you Daniel Gagnon. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Marie. It's a privilege to be here.
Well, it's a privilege to have you spend some time with me and with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast audience. So please tell the audience a little bit about who you are, your family, and just a little bit more about how you came to where you are.
Absolutely. So as we heard in your little intro there, I'm on 40 years in the workplace, 6 careers, and later I'll get into the notion of self-disruption and what that meant to me and how that played out. But let's reel that back a bit for background. So I have one brother. We were raised by our parents, our natural parents, and mostly lived in the Montreal area with a pit stop in Ontario. So we were a very working class family. My father was an electrician, mostly worked on construction. My mother stayed home, took care of us. My father is French-Canadian heritage. My mother is Irish-Canadian heritage. And that dual heritage is going to come into play in terms of when we discuss the groups as well, because growing up with a dual heritage, many people experience that. But in the time and place that my brother and I were born in Canada in the 60s and when we were growing up in the 70s, that sort of English-speaking, French-speaking divide, especially in Quebec and Ontario, was quite something to navigate. And, it's very much not as prevalent as it was, but there was some tension and there were some things to navigate. So that'll come into the story. So other than that, I'm married, my second marriage. I have 3 sons from my first marriage and a stepdaughter from my second. So I like to say that I've been married for 35 years, but it took 2 separate weddings to make that happen. All the children now are adults. The 2 youngest are 30. The oldest is 34. We have a great relationship with them. So that's all good. And so that sort of gives you the basic building blocks of my background. There are some important stories in my childhood and adolescence that I'd like to share with you.
Sure. Why don't you go right ahead? Because that was my next question. So what are some of the incidents from your childhood that you think really formed you into who you are today?
So there were 2, and they were drastically different.
Go ahead. Let us know. I'm all ears.
One was very emotional. So I was about 6 years old. And at one point, our father was on construction and work dried up in the Montreal area. So never one to sit back and wait for things to happen. My father went searching for the work, and he wound up in Sudbury, Ontario, which was booming at the time due to the nickel mines and so on. So he and my mother made a deal that he would go ahead and prospect for work and send for us at the appropriate time. So he was gone out of our lives for about a year. And this was very early childhood. I was in kindergarten, first grade. And I remember missing him terribly. I think I only saw him twice that year. And things were hard for him too, because he later told me that he got to Sudbury and the initial contract ran out. And he wound up going as far afield as working on nuclear power plant construction in Ohio and just, all over the middle portion of the continent and always sending the money home. But he always funneled it through the bank in Sudbury so my mother wouldn't worry. So in her mind, he was always just in Sudbury, but he had to move around quite a bit. Anyway, he was gone for that time. And finally, he sent for us. But before that, something that would be very formative in who I am happened. And I know this is going to sound like a very trivial childhood trauma compared to what others can go through and what others have been through, but it was my experience. So I'm going to put it out there for what it's worth. First grade, first couple of days of school, my father's been away for 6 months now. The money is sporadic. And there's a book fair at school. So our mother had already, taught us the love of reading. She read to us almost every night. And here I had my first opportunity to buy a book. So long story short, my mother could only afford to give me a quarter. So I show up. And I have what seems to me like a lot of money in my pocket. And the first thing I see is a book with a big rocket ship to the moon on it. And it's one of the Tin books. So I pick it up and I go to the cash and there was the principal and teachers, and I give them my quarter. And they just look at me and they say, "Sorry, Daniel, this book is $1.25 and you only have 25 cents. So you can't have that. But there's a bin over there with some less expensive books. You can look at that." So very despondent, I look over to the bin, and it's all like little baby books. But I picked one up anyway, and I remember it had like a little baby chicken on it, and it had like 17 words in the whole book. But I bought it because I had the quarter. But I came home crying, and I explained to my mother what had happened. I asked her why we didn't have the money. And to anyone who's experienced hardship in childhood, I apologize for this because I never experienced food hardship or shelter hardship.
Don't apologize, Daniel. It's a lovely story because children often have these defining moments. And what happened at that moment was when you became aware of social class at a young age. And you also became aware of limitations and disappointments and what to do to overcome disappointments. I think it's a wonderful story. And thank you for sharing it.
And there is a surprise conclusion to the story.
Okay, what is it?
A few months later, in the summer, before going to second grade, my father finally sent for us, and we were all reunited and went to Sudbury. And a few weeks after our arrival, something happened. I got home from playing outside, and there was a bunch of books on the table. One about sharks, which I remember very well. It's the first big book I ever read. Another about squirrels, and another about history. And they're all beautiful books, and they were covered in plastic. And I said to my mom, "What's this?" And she said, "Well, I told your father what happened that time you wanted to buy a book. And now that we're here, he's committed to going to the library for you every 2 weeks and get you anything you want."
Ah, that's so lovely.
So I remember getting to page 100 of the shark book and being all proud to tell him. I was 8 years old, and I can tell you right now that started a lifelong habit. I calculate I've read an average of a book a week since.
Wow. I was the rocket ship underneath your reading love, right?
It certainly was. The other childhood incident, drastically different, but one that taught me another emotional lesson is, Sudbury was a great place to grow up because it was wild at the time. It was a smaller town, and we had lakes and blueberry fields, and playing outside is all we did. It was rudely awakened when we came back to Montreal in a working class district with very densely populated streets. But I remember one day we were at the beach. It was that first summer still. So I was 8. My brother was probably 4.5. And my mother was with us at the beach. My dad was off working. And my brother and I can't swim yet. So we're just sort of waiting and walking out. And I turn to the left to look around. And I turn to the right. My little brother is gone. I can't see him. I look, and he had stepped off like a ledge, and he was in like water above both our heads, and thrashing. And I tried to get to him. So I started thrashing the water and screaming at the, "Tim, Tim," there's the Irish part. Our childhood names are Danny and Timmy. Timmy, Timmy, Timmy. My mother comes rushing and dives in and drags him out, spitting and sputtering. And we get to the sand, and she looks at me and said, "You saved your brother's life." And in that moment, it didn't really register. It's just like, okay, well, he's fine. I didn't do much. I just screamed. But he said, had you not been there, or had you not looked back, or had you not been waiting out together, he would have drowned. And to that point, my brother had just been a little bit of an annoyance to me, as all little brothers are. I mean, we played together. We got along great. But, he was my little brother. But from then, I sort of felt protective of him. And to this day, we're incredibly close, and we've helped each other through so many things and so many low points in life. We've always been there for each other. And both our parents passed away at the age of 62, 4 years apart. Their lives weren't easy, and we can get into that or not, but we only have each other now family-wise. So I think that closeness is much stronger than it would have been without that near drowning incident. I'm not sure, but I just remember the feelings of being surprised at the feelings of relief and love that came over me when I realized he could have died.
Mm-hmm. when you realize how much you love somebody in your family. So that was great. And also, they say that the people that cause us the most trouble are the ones we get closest to.
Probably caused me trouble, right? As brothers will, I'm sure
Yeah.
I caused him trouble too.
Yeah, I'm sure. So you were born into these two groups, really, and many more, because we all have multiple groups that we're born into. But one would be French Canadian culture in Quebec and Montreal specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And then also Irish culture. But then again, your parents, they weren't direct immigrants, but they were affected by the cultures that immigrants had created in those areas. So how have those and any other groups that you belong to, it can be language, right, which would be related to that. Could be religion, could be social class, could be your neighborhood, could be anything that just was the natural thing that kids did when you were growing up, would you say has influenced you and continues to influence you so that as a leader?
So one thing that definitely growing up with a dual heritage did, as I alluded to, it certainly always caused a little bit of initial difficulty, especially coming back and forth from Quebec and Ontario, even though Sudbury was at the time, and I believe it still is, a majority Francophone community. It's Ontario Francophones, which is, to your point, and you pointed it out, Quebec Francophones, Ontario Francophones, very different sort of mentality. And another interesting point is my father came from the north of Quebec in Bidibee, which is actually pretty much across the border from Sudbury. So also northern mining town mentality. He worked on the farm, he did logging, he learned to be an electrician, he went to the army, worked on construction. So very tough frontiersman life. My father had a bit of Clint Eastwood in him. In that sense. My mother was actually first generation Canadian, and my grandmother and my great grandfather escaped Belfast in 1920 with 8 kids and the clothes on their back from the Civil War.
Wow, that's certainly part of forming your identity, isn't it?
Absolutely, especially since my grandmother was like Lady Violet, and she was a very strong personality, and she was actually the one who pressured my mother into forcing my father to bring us back to Montreal, and that broke him as a man in many ways and made my adolescence difficult. But my grandmother passed on this delusion to my mother that because of, they were well off in Ireland, but she was the youngest. So she bore this lifelong delusion that they were somehow uprooted aristocrats who once in Canada were just going through a wee spot of a rough patch. That wee spot of a rough patch, in Granny's case, lasted 83 years. But she never said that it was anything but. And to my mother, small towns were... I know my father started his business in Sudbury, and he was looking perhaps at moving to Sault Ste. Marie because he had contracts there. My mother just said, no, you take us back to Montreal. My father loved her and us, and he chose us over the business. One thing that really comes to mind, though, through all of that is moving schools. And my brother and I became very adaptable. We learned very quickly how to navigate different groups, how to be a majority within a minority, within a minority, within a majority. And one tool that our parents realized would be essential for us was to give us native speaker fluency in both languages and native speaker accents. They told us the only way that we could actually go through life with a dual heritage would be to be able to, with each group, sound like the group. And there's research on this, that one of the major causes of exclusion from groups is accent or sound,
especially in Quebec. Did you know that Quebec has the highest accent prejudice of all the provinces?
Yeah. And in fact, I experienced that because my French wasn't up to par when I came back from Ontario, because I had become Franco-Ontarien. Right? And yet when I arrived in Sudbury, although we were going to French school, we landed in a predominantly English-speaking neighborhood, and our last name was very suspect. And the only reason we were accepted, despite our adaptability, is that our next-door neighbor, who wound up being my dad's partner in business, were a large Irish family who got us, and they sort of ruled the roost on the street. So we were under their protection.
They vouched for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we sounded like them, right?
Yeah. Well, that sort of negotiating sounds to me like you're very conscious of both groups of both languages and needing to do specific things to be accepted in each one, and learning to negotiate that, as you said, made you really flexible and maybe led you to being in that agile leadership that you're in now.
It actually led me to being able to approach other cultures with confidence. So to the point where I became fascinated with German, learned the language, visited, and wound up. My first wife was from Germany, so I now speak and teach regularly in German. What the Germans tell me is an extremely surprisingly good accent for a Canadian. I remember my German college teacher, we did an oral exam, and he said, your grammar was terrible, and half of what you said was gibberish, but your accent is so good that you remind me of the character Felix Krull, the con man, in one of Thomas Mann's novels. So he said, I'm passing you just on that, but next time, brush up on the grammar, please.
I had that problem too because I was learning French as an adult, but my accent was good. I think it has to do with being musical and picking things up. Yeah, so my accent was pretty good. And so the first teachers classified me as being a lazy French Canadian who, probably just spoke English back to their parents all the time and were always berating me for not having good grammar and not being able to write with the right spelling and stuff like that. Until they found out that I actually was just learning French. This was my first year. And then my husband and I went to Grenoble in southern France, where his relatives are from. When we were coming back, the taxi driver asked how long my male friend had been visiting me. And I was flabbergasted because I was a lot less capable French speaker than my husband was, but my accent became Grenoblois. So they, at that time, thought, I must have been from there. It was the subject of a lot of teasing when I came back.
Oh, I completely hear you.
Yeah.
My wife was from North Germany, and I made a lot of friends in Bavaria, so I even took to imitating Prussian in Bavaria and Bavarian in Prussia. That's when you know that you're getting a bit too far with your Felix Krullism.
Yes, totally. So you then grew up and you chose to belong to other groups. And some of those you've already talked about. Your first wife was from Germany and learning the German language. Something from understanding German culture and language would certainly stick with you, especially if you're married to someone from that country. What other groups did you join? And some cultural aspect is stuck with you today.
The groups that I joined thereafter, the most important one was a group in the widest sense of the word. So this actually comes back to adolescence as well. When we came back to Montreal, and I was getting very good grades in primary school. I'll just reel back a bit. The apartment I was born in Montreal was across the street from the best private school in Quebec at the time, and still is. It was run by brothers, and it was a private school not as a hideaway for lazy rich kids, but it was entirely based on academics and stringent entrance exams. And I can't believe that, seeing those kids out there in their English public school looking uniforms, my parents seeing that every day, I can't believe that they didn't dream of getting us above working class. And long story short, when we came back to Montreal, my best friend all of a sudden in sixth grade says, I hope you're going to the college. I said, what? He said, well, my parents are sending me to the college, the one on Rosemont Avenue. I said, wait a minute, I was born across the street from there. He said, yeah. He said, it's actually quite affordable, but you need good grades. You need to pass the exam. Ask your parents. He said, you and I have some of the best grades in this whole school. He said, I'm not going without you. So I asked my parents, and I saw the look on their faces. And I expected to, no, it's too expensive. We can't afford it. We can't make ends meet. And they looked at each other, and my dad said, there is no way we aren't going to do everything in our power to send you guys there. Absolutely. Consider it done as long as you can pass the exam.
Great.
This was a big thing to say because he knew he was condemning himself at that point to subsistence living and never buying a home and never taking vacations for the 9 years that it would take to get us both through that school.
And it's a loss of identity because when you're in a certain social class and a certain trades group, you feel most comfortable associating with people that are in the same group most of the time. And so when your children move into some other unknown space, you wonder if you'll lose communication with them. It's hard for parents. It's amazing what they did, really.
It was. And I remember, at one point money was very tight there. About the only thing they were making the payments on was the school. And my dad went through a rough period when he started drinking a lot. And many of the things he and I would get into arguments when I was 13, 14, 15. And I remember that a lot of the arguments were triggered. And now that you mentioned that, he was testing me to see if I was moving too far away from him.
Yeah.
And I was, but not in a non-loving way, because it was a grade-based academic thing. I was exposed to every social economic status you can imagine in that school.
But he may still have felt excluded from it.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
So
joining that college was significant for you, right?
That was absolutely significant because I got to choose my groups within that. And the groups that I joined and sometimes created had the particularity of drawing from every status.
Mm-hmm.
It was around music. It was around clothes. I mean, within the confines of wearing a suit and a tie, you could tell the ones who were listening to Pink Floyd from the ones who were listening to Elvis Costello, like me. We still had space for creativity. It was just late 70s, early 80s. So creating those groups and realizing I had a steady girlfriend the last 2 years, and her parents had a place in Florida and a cottage up north and boats and luxury cars, and they brought me to Florida. I went to the cottage every weekend, things that I could never have imagined. The closest I ever got was last time we had a vacation. I'd been anywhere as a family. It was once maybe to Plattsburgh, and before that it was the lakes in Sudbury. There was no money.
But that probably helped to bridge social class transitions and future careers and interactions with people too, because you had that experience of being in Florida with the rich people in the boats, and you picked up some of the social cues there.
By the time I was 18, I could basically hang around with anyone. So did my brother. We adopted our chameleon language right down to behavior, and sort of like a small scale version of that Zelig movie with Woody Allen. We could turn into anybody we wanted to. But it was a coping and survival mechanism. It was to not be rejected. Rejection is as painful as physical pain to the brain.
And death even.
And death, yes.
I mean, it's as painful as other people dying in your life.
There you go.
So there was that. Anything else that you grew into as an adult?
So after that, school education-wise, in Quebec, the system is slightly different. So you can't go straight to university from high school. We have a 2-year sort of junior college. CEGEP. You wind up with sort of the equivalent of...
like a diploma, really.
Yeah, it's like a diploma, right? And my dad was actually working at a TV station, and he got me in when I was 18 or 19 to work as a stagehand on a telethon. And that was easy to get because they needed so many people that all you had to basically do was have a pulse, and all the employees got their sons and daughters in to help for that weekend. But I found myself enjoying it. So I started university in art history. I had done my CEGEP in psychology, but I wasn't sure about that either. I was more leaning towards a gap year or something, and lo and behold, I started getting more and more work at the TV station and really enjoying the stage work. But that was another group. These were rough crew guys, ex-sailors, people who worked on films. It was a whole different world. And again, I was able to fit in. And what I learned from them from that group was adaptability. We did a lot of live things, and live television is the most agile, adaptable thing on the planet. So I spent a couple of years doing that. And then still at that same TV station, I got into post-production, editing and character generator special effects. And I did that for several more years, and actually won a Gemini. So that's like a Canadian Emmy for work on a local comedy series that was sort of Quebec's answer to SCTV. And from that group, the post-production group, I learned a love of craft. But here my first self-disruption started. So after winning the Gemini, the next Monday was back to what we were doing, a local car dealership commercial. I said to myself, I can't take these ups and downs. I want to move forward from the Gemini, not back to things we were doing when the first day I arrived here 3.5 years ago. So started taking an interest in what was then emerging as multimedia and the first websites. I had left the TV station and partnered with a local entrepreneur to start up my own studio at that time. Wound up with 15 employees by the time I left. Didn't leave with much because equipment was so expensive and the salaries we were paying were so competitive that I basically walked away with nothing lost, nothing gained.
Well, the experience of running a business.
Absolutely. Running a business. I was well-intended, but I made a lot of the mistakes that I see managers still today making, and was prey to a lot of the cognitive biases. And I know I created, fear sometimes. And I look back, I was a very young manager. I was 31 years old, more of an entrepreneur / startup founder / manager. And boy, if I could go back there and make some amends, I would.
Yeah. Most people who are startup founders are innovative and visionary and terrible managers. They didn't realize they signed up for management when they did the startup.
Oh, yeah.
So then you had a few more careers after that, right?
Oh, yeah. Then I continued that in the web, especially right through the dot-com crash. And after the crash, I wound up working at Bell's internet service for 3 years as an employee, doing employee training on e-commerce and things like that. Then I self-disrupted and was disrupted when I was laid off just before I could resign to go and try my hand at being a stock market trader, which is what my brother was doing with incredible success. And he couldn't fathom that his big brother, whom he admired, couldn't have as much success as he did in this. So I did my Canadian security courses, my trader training courses, and I joined him in the firm he was with. He vouched for me, and I proceeded to do an absolutely terrible job of it. 8 months later, I quit before my brother could be forced to fire me. And he just couldn't get it. He said, Dan, what's the matter? And he said, Tim, I said, I'm looking at all these flashing numbers all day, and I'm getting into how can oil be going up? The news from Saudi Arabia is bad. And I was injecting all kinds of macroeconomic, geopolitical reasoning into it. And he kept trying to tell me that's not the way this works. He said, just look at the screen. And it made no sense to me. Finally, I told him, I said, Tim, here's the difference between you and me. You know that movie, The Beautiful Mind?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're Russell Crowe, all right, looking at this and making sense of all those dancing numbers. And I'm some guy watching the movie.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
And then he got it.
It helps to have that metaphor, right? Have those movies to fall back on.
Mhm.
Tell me a little bit about your personality and temperament. So, personality you grew into and temperament you were born with. And you started to allude to that when you talked about the difference between you and your brother. What would you say is like characteristic of you from the time you were little, and what have you grown into personality-wise?
So I was very introverted, self-reflective, used to love playing with a Meccano and construction sets and reading. So I was very introverted, but I understood the survival imperative of being gregarious and outgoing as well. So from a young age, I was able to mix those. But if you left me a choice, I would just reach out to people from time to time and certainly would want to stay close to family and some friends. But I could be very content just riding my bike and reading for months on end if I were not disrupted. But I don't take it as an invasion of my privacy.
You're a social introvert. There are social introverts, and I don't want to use the word antisocial because it's like a psychological term, but people who are not interested in the social aspect, introverts. And it's the same with extroverts. You can have a very social extrovert, and you can have an extrovert who is not social. I know. So social introverts really enjoy people's company. They just don't pursue it all the time because
I let it come to me mostly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it's fine if it comes. And, I don't make people beg to see me and never return the favor, or, I do make an effort to reach out. My brother's the exact opposite. He's very social, but he's also actually more gregarious and more outgoing and the life of the party. But it comes at a tremendous cost to him. And he has to recuperate through introversion after too much of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what have you added on to your personality? Like as I got older, I certainly added on discretion and patience. What have you added on?
So I think what I've not added, but what I've attained is balance, which I never had. I was always going too far to one extreme or too far to the other. And that balancing out was very difficult. Now it comes naturally. Mm-hmm. Which is what I mean when I say I no longer wait to reach out. I have an inner sense of when it's time for me to make a move and when it's time to reestablish the balance of friendships. One way friendships become very tiresome for the person always doing the reaching out, even though they may know you're this kind of person or an introvert or so on. There's only so much nudging that one friend will do before giving up, saying, well, it's your turn,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you have talked about this quite a bit already in small ways, but is there an incident that you can recall when you felt that you had a cultural disruption or cognitive dissonance where you just went, whoa, this is how I thought everybody lived or did things, and it's just particular to my experience?
A very small but very remarkable one for me. In Germany in '84, when I was there visiting a friend from Munich who came over and visited my German professor one summer, and we hung out and became great friends. So I returned the favor and visited him. So we're at a family dinner, I think it was, and there's some other friends there. And I'm the only one eating by doing this North American thing of transferring my fork to my right hand every time. And at one point I realized everyone's looking at me and sort of kind of baffled. And I'm sure most people had heard of this, but I don't think they'd ever had a North American sit down at their table and do that. And Thomas, my friend, just smiled at me. And after the meal, he said, I noticed that in North America too. Why do you guys do that? It's such a waste of energy. I have not taken my fork out of my left hand since. It's 40 years ago.
That's great. That's really great.
It was a real light bulb moment.
Yeah.
Something so simple. And here is this very adjacent European culture. And eating a meal is very social. If you're the only one transferring your utensils around, doing this utensils dance all through the meal and get noticed, you think about that and you realize, wow, this right hand, left hand thing is a local thing. It's not the whole world, and never mind chopsticks and so on.
I think it's those little small things that give us the crack that opens up to the bigger understanding.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing what that does, because then it readies you for the bigger surprises, I think.
Yeah.
You have a more welcoming perspective on other things that you learn about the culture.
Yeah, totally. So we're getting close to the end of the interview, and I'm wondering, when people come to work with you, what brings out the best in you? What allows you to have an environment where you can actually be at your best?
So now in my sixth career, right, the other two after the trader was I went into IT and project management consultant, stepped away from that, became an agile practitioner. And then finally, my current incarnation, developing leadership and organizational agility. I think this is the one. I'm running out of steam on the reincarnations. Let's put it that way. What I look for and the people that I want to work with, what I'm looking to have now is the highest possible impact and serving the highest possible purpose with organizations or individuals that I have the honor and the privilege to work for. So that means that what I'm looking for in a client, be it an organization or a leader who's looking for coaching, an organization that's looking for consulting and advisory and training, what have you, the first thing I need it to be is to be a genuine commitment. There is too much psychological safety washing, too much DEI washing, too much eco washing going on. Everybody wants to get on the new buzzwords, check a box. We've done X amount of training. We have one person come in, give 2 seminars. We're good on this. Let's move on.
Yeah, then that inoculates them against any change.
That completely says, the leadership has decided that that's what you're going to get. This is all we've got in terms of allowing this organization to become a learning organization and thrives. Recently, I've begun walking away, like saying no at the outset. And I've even respectfully ended 1 or 2 contracts where I realized that despite a promising beginning, I was there to whitewash.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can give anyone advice, the only way you can actually be true to your convictions in this type of thing, I can do that now. It's been 40 years, but if you're a younger adult with family, it's very hard to walk away from a contract based on your principles. I appreciate that. But the way to inoculate yourself against that is to put just enough money in the bank to be able to speak truth to power and move on. There will always be other opportunities. So I look for commitment. I look for a genuine opportunity to make a difference where the leadership wants to genuinely move their organization ahead. They've realized that in this world we're in, they need everyone's input. They need their employees' discretionary effort. They need every stakeholder to have skin in the game. And the only way to achieve that is removing fear. So it's at least not systemic and not purposely induced.
Mm-hmm.
Remove fear, create agency, not empowerment. Empowerment is, you have to come to the office 3 days a week, but I empower you to choose the days. Agency is, work from where you want. I trust you.
Yeah, as long as you get the job done.
Yeah, I bristle at the word because it's become whitewashing for just enough decision making to give people the impression that they have a smidgen of control over their destiny, but it's very far from human agency.
Yeah, it's really more like how you treat a 2-year-old who's screaming for a cookie before supper. You can have a half an apple or a quarter of an apple. It's really not the way you would treat an adult.
No.
So here's your soapbox moment. What would you like to promote?
So very simply, Agile Leader Academy, which is a collective which I founded here with my business associate, Bruno Collet. And we're a training. By training, I mean we offer training on vertical development for leaders, how to address your cognitive biases, how neuroscience and the way we're wired. I mean, everything about what the Agile movement has been bringing forth and what the psychological safety movement has been bringing forth, even diversity, equity, all of that goes against the hardwiring of our brains. So it's not enough to say, well, leaders have to change. How do you change? Well, that's what we teach, what we coach, how we help transformation initiatives within organizations to actually work with an awareness of neuroscience and our cognitive biases. And we coach to that effect. So if you're an organization, an individual, a leader who sees any opportunity for making a committed attempt at moving your organization forward and making it a learning organization where people have skin in the game and where you're basically fostering human agency and becoming anti-fragile as a person and as an organization, then we're for you.
Great. So it's the Agile Leadership Academy?
It's agileleader.academy.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also look me up on LinkedIn because in my featured section, I have a bunch of webinars and talks and conferences where I've been to or I've presented over the years. And that could give people also a good idea of my approach, what I'm about, and on the website. The website is a bit bare bones, but it's just enough information to make people want to learn more. So between the LinkedIn, Daniel Gagnon, Gagnon, Norman, Oswald Norman, and the website, you should have enough so that if you're really serious about transformation and moving yourself forward in your vertical development as a leader, then by all means, contact us.
Sounds good. So, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Other than, well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I was mentioning to you before we started the show, I think your approach with the groups is groundbreaking. I think very few practitioners are addressing this right now. And it's an incredibly powerful lens through which to understand people's development. And certainly I was very enthusiastic when I figured out that this was your approach. And just preparing for this interview actually shed light on many things in my life when I viewed things through this group lens. So, I think you'll be thanked and congratulated for bringing that into the media space.
Thank you. That's very generous of you to just say that. I appreciated your time and the interview and your insights and hearing about your life. And I'm looking forward to sharing everything with the listeners and moving forward with more connections. So thank you, Daniel.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a great honor.
Daniel Gagnon grew up with a foot in two cultures and languages in Montreal, Canada, mastering English and French from a French-Canadian father and an Irish-Canadian mother. His childhood memories showed an early awareness of social class and of the importance of protecting those you love. From a variety of hands-on jobs to technical and computer IT jobs, Daniel honed his skills at managing projects with the people skills he learned in childhood, based on learning how to belong to different groups. At one point, this skill took him to learning German, going to Germany, and finding a German wife. Priding himself on being able to create rapport with anyone, Daniel now heads the Agile Leadership Academy, where he helps leaders of organizations create real change based on practical tools to build a truly safe workplace culture. If you enjoyed this interview with Daniel Gagnon, please share it with a friend with your phone, quick, before you forget. While you're at it, you can type lovethepodcast.com/culture and leadership to leave a review, which would really make my day. Thank you so much for listening, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Want to show some appreciation? You can buy me a coffee. What? How do you buy a coffee for a podcast owner? Well, there's a way. Let me explain. You go to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. That's spelled MarieGervais. So it's buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. And when you go to that website, what's going to happen is you'll get a chance to click on 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 cups of coffee at $5 a piece to help contribute to the cost of the podcast. And yes, it's $5 for a cup of coffee because it's quality coffee for a quality podcast. So I hope you will contribute and you'll help us to reduce the costs of the podcast by going to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. Thank you in advance for your generous contribution.